In the late 1990s, the golden age of the American arcade collapsed overnight. Thousands of neon-lit family entertainment centers were shuttered, abandoned, and left to rot in the forgotten wings of dying shopping malls across the country. The corporations liquidated the assets, cut the power grids, and permanently chained the doors shut. But when they abandoned these massive, windowless concrete rooms to the dark, they left something deeply unnatural behind. Because according to the local police reports and classified urban exploration footage, cutting the power wasn't enough to turn all the machines off. These are 3 deeply classified, completely true encounters from inside abandoned arcades, places where the electricity was permanently severed, but the games refused to die. Story 1. In the winter of 1999, a massive 2-story family entertainment center in rural Ohio filed for corporate bankruptcy. The property was slated for demolition in the spring. To prevent local teenagers from breaking in and vandalizing the remaining copper wiring, the bank hired a 50-year-old private night watchman named Thomas to patrol the empty, freezing building from midnight to 6 a.m. The main breaker box had been physically destroyed weeks prior. The building was a tomb. It was completely pitch black, illuminated only by the thin, sweeping beam of Thomas's heavy metal flashlight. At exactly 3:15 a.m. on his 4th night, Thomas was walking the perimeter of the sub-basement prize room. The absolute silence of the concrete basement was broken by a low, vibrating, electronic hum. He froze. The humming wasn't coming from the street. It was vibrating through the concrete floor directly beneath his boots. He slowly turned his flashlight toward the darkest, furthest corner of the prize room. A faint, sickening amber glow was bleeding out from behind a row of dead photo booths. Thomas drew his heavy baton and stepped carefully around the rusted machines. Sitting alone in the absolute darkness was a vintage 1980s mechanical fortune teller machine, and the glass case was glowing brightly, fully powered on. Inside the glass box sat a mechanical dummy wearing a rotting red turban. Its face was carved from smooth, pale porcelain, but its eyes were completely wrong. They were hyper-realistic, bloodshot human eyes that stared blankly forward. Thomas assumed a squatter had run a generator line to the machine. Keeping his eyes locked on the dummy, he slowly circled to the back of the heavy wooden cabinet and shined his flashlight at the baseboard. His blood ran completely cold. The thick black power cord extending from the back of the machine was violently severed in half. The exposed, frayed copper wires were resting in a puddle on the damp concrete. The machine was not plugged into anything. It had no battery. As Thomas stared at the severed cord in absolute disbelief, the low electronic hum violently spiked in volume, morphing into the horrific, metallic grinding sound of rusted gears forcing themselves to move. He spun back around to face the glass. The dummy was no longer looking forward. Its porcelain neck had rotated 90 degrees. The movement wasn't jerky or robotic. It was terrifyingly, impossibly smooth, and the hyper-realistic eyes were now staring directly, intensely, into Thomas's face. The mechanical grinding stopped. The arcade returned to dead, heavy silence. Then, with a soft click, a small, yellow cardboard ticket slowly slid out of the brass dispenser slot at the bottom of the machine. Thomas couldn't breathe. His hands trembling violently, he reached out into the sickly amber light and pulled the ticket from the slot. The machine hadn't printed a generic fortune. The text wasn't printed in standard machine ink. It looked like it had been hastily written in dark, wet, smeared fluid. And it read exactly, "Look up, Thomas." It knew his name. Thomas froze in absolute terror. He slowly, mechanically tilted his head upward, looking into the reflective glass casing of the machine to see the ceiling directly above him. Reflected perfectly in the glass, illuminated by the amber light, was a massive, elongated shadow. with impossibly long, pale limbs, and it was silently dropping down from the acoustic ceiling tiles directly over Thomas's head. Thomas abandoned his post and barely made it to his vehicle. When the demolition crew arrived 3 months later, they found his heavy metal flashlight crushed on the floor, but the fortune teller machine and whatever dropped from the ceiling were completely gone.
Story 2. Urban exploration in abandoned megamalls carries immense physical risks. The structures are rotting, the air is toxic, and the floors are on the verge of total collapse. But in 2006, 2 experienced urban explorers named Mark and Sarah broke into a legendary sealed megamall in Pennsylvania. Their specific goal was to locate the forgotten sub-basement arcade that had been walled off in the early 90s. After 3 hours of navigating collapsed drywall and flooded service corridors, they found a heavy steel maintenance store hidden behind a fake drywall partition. They forced the rusted lock with a crowbar and stepped inside. Unlike the rest of the rotting mall, the hidden arcade was completely untouched. It was a perfectly preserved time capsule. The patterned carpets weren't water damaged. The rows of arcade cabinets were perfectly aligned, devoid of a single speck of dust. But as Mark swept his high-powered headlamp across the back wall, he noticed a severe anomaly. Sitting at the very end of a row of standard fighting games was a massive, entirely black arcade cabinet. It had no side artwork, no marquee title, and no coin slots. It was a completely smooth, monolithic black box. The control panel featured only one joystick and one single, unlabeled, blood red button. It looked less like an entertainment device and more like a piece of classified military hardware. Sarah noticed a heavy industrial power outlet on the wall directly behind it. Driven by the dangerous curiosity that gets urban explorers killed, she picked up the cabinet's thick, heavy plug and forced it into the socket. The screen violently cracked to life with a blinding, harsh white flash. The heavy glass cathode ray tube whined with an agonizing, high-pitched frequency that made the explorers cover their ears. As the blinding white flash faded, the screen resolved into an image, but it wasn't a video game menu. It was a live, pixelated, 16-bit rendering of the exact arcade room they were standing in. It was a live digital mirror. Displayed on the screen were 2 16-bit avatars standing in front of the digital cabinet. And as Mark slowly raised his hand in absolute shock, the pixelated avatar on the screen perfectly, instantly mirrored his exact real-world movement. Mark stared at the glowing glass in absolute paralyzing disbelief. He slowly lowered his trembling hand back to his side, expecting the digital reflection to do the same. But the avatar on the screen did not lower its arm. The digital mirror was broken. The pixelated character representing Mark remained completely frozen with its hand raised, defying reality. A heavy, rhythmic thumping sound began to echo from deep inside the wooden casing of the arcade machine, like a slow, wet heartbeat. On the screen, Mark's avatar slowly rotated its digital head to look directly at Sarah's avatar. Without warning, the digital version of Mark violently lunged forward on the screen, wrapping its pixelated hands around the digital throat of Sarah's avatar. As it did, a horrific, high-pitched screech erupted from the machine's rusted speakers. In the real world, Sarah screamed in visceral terror, stumbling backward over her own feet and dropping her heavy flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the dark, geometric carpet, casting erratic, terrifying shadows across the dead machines. Mark grabbed Sarah by the jacket and pulled her up. He looked back at the screen one final time. Both of the 16-bit avatars were completely gone. The screen was pitch black, but fading into the center of the glass, rendering with terrifying, impossible realism, were 2 bloodshot, unblinking human eyes. The single, unlabeled red button on the control panel violently depressed on its own with a loud mechanical clack. A jagged, blood-red text overlay flashed across the dark screen. It simply read,
Insert coin to survive. Before either of them could breathe, the heavy steel maintenance door at the far end of the arcade violently slammed shut on its own, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a massive, echoing metallic boom. They sprinted blindly through the claustrophobic aisles, crashing into dead machines in the pitch black. Mark used his rusted crowbar to violently beat the steel locking mechanism until the metal finally sheared and gave way. They breached the door and fled into the flooded maintenance tunnels, never looking back. The Mega Mall was demolished 6 months later. The demolition crew noted that the sub-basement arcade was completely empty. There was no black cabinet. Story 3. In the 1990s, the massive, sprawling plastic tube mazes suspended above the dining room floors were the absolute highlight of indoor family entertainment centers. But these tight, suffocating architectural nightmares were impossible to properly monitor. And when these massive buildings were abandoned in the early 2000s, the labyrinth of plastic tunnels became the perfect, lightless hiding place for things that did not want to be found. In 2010, a highly experienced urban explorer named David broke into a condemned, massively overgrown entertainment center in the Pacific Northwest. Against every survival instinct, he decided to map the interior of the suspended tube maze. He climbed into the gaping black mouth of the main slide and began to crawl. The heavy plastic creaked agonizingly under his weight. The air inside the tubes was incredibly dense, freezing cold, and smelled overwhelmingly of rotting copper and damp fur. At exactly 3:33 a.m., David reached the center junction of the maze, suspended 20 feet above the dining room floor. He stopped crawling. The absolute silence was broken by the sound of heavy, wet, dragging friction coming from the dark tunnel directly ahead of him. David held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shined his high-powered headlamp down the long, narrow corridor. The tunnel wasn't empty. There was a massive, unnatural blockage jammed tightly into the plastic cylinder about 30 feet ahead. It looked like an enormous, elongated mass of matted, decaying purple fur. It was the rotting remains of one of the original 1980s mascot suits. But the physical proportions were entirely wrong. The mass was far too large to contain a human skeleton. The moment the beam of his headlamp hit the purple fur, the heavy, dragging sound instantly stopped. The massive entity froze, entirely wedged inside the tight plastic space. David's survival instincts finally kicked in. He slowly, silently began to crawl backward. But as his knee scraped against the plastic, a deep, wet, raspy inhalation of breath echoed down the tunnel. The massive fur-covered entity shifted. The thick plastic tube groaned under an immense, sudden distribution of weight. Suddenly, an impossibly long arm shot out from the front of the rotting mass. It had 4 padded, oversized cartoon-style fingers, but the fabric was stained heavily with dark, dried fluid. The cartoon hand gripped the curved wall of the tube so violently that the thick, transparent plastic began to spiderweb and crack. And then, the massive entity began to violently, rapidly pull itself forward through the tunnel.
A childlike, pre-recorded voice box triggered from deep inside the creature's chest cavity, warped by years of battery decay. It giggled, a sickening, metallic sound, and whispered, "Come play with us. We have been waiting so long."
The entity moved at an impossible, terrifying speed, its joints popping and grinding as it forced its massive frame through the narrow space. David didn't look back. He threw himself blindly down a vertical drop tube, abandoning his camera and his equipment in the dark. He crashed onto the dining room floor, shattering his wrist, and sprinted for the shattered front doors. The recovered headlamp footage cuts out exactly 2 seconds after he dropped it. But in the final frame, the face of the entity is visible. It wasn't wearing a mask. The purple fur was growing directly out of pale, stretched human skin. We abandoned these massive entertainment centers because they stopped being profitable. We turned off the power and locked the doors, assuming the machines and the mascots would simply gather dust and rot away in the silence.
But they didn't rot. They adapted to the dark. They learned how to operate without electricity. They learned how to move without being seen. And eventually, the rusted chains on the front doors of the arcades will rust through completely, and they won't have to wait in the dark anymore.
The night is long, and the shift is only beginning. Subscribe before the clock strikes 3.